They say an alpha never kneels. But what happens when the world forces you to your knees, not with chains, but with silence? When the pack you bled for turns their backs like you were nothing more than a ghost they chose to stop seeing? Tonight, I'm taking you into the throne room where a queen was made in the exact moment she was meant to be destroyed. This isn't your typical rejection story. This is about what happens when you stop begging for a place at the table and burn the whole damn thing down. Stay with me until the end, because what Lyra does in that throne room will rewrite everything you thought you knew about power. And hey, drop a like and comment your city below so I know my pack is riding with me on this one. The obsidian throne room stretched like a cathedral built for demons. Every surface gleamed black and gold, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the faces of the court back at themselves, distorted and hollow. Chandeliers hung from iron chains thick as a man's wrist, crystals catching firelight and scattering it across the assembly like shattered stars. The air tasted of smoke and expensive wine, and something else, something metallic and primal that crawled down the throat and settled in the gut like a warning. Lyra Virel stood in the center of it all, and she was drowning. Not in water, in eyes. Hundreds of them, tracking her every breath, dissecting her posture, measuring the exact angle of her chin to determine how much fight she had left. The marble floor beneath her feet was cold enough to leach the warmth from her bones, but she didn't let herself shiver. Couldn't. The moment she showed weakness, they'd fall on her like vultures on a roadkill. She'd learned that much in her 3 years at court. Weakness was blood in the water here. The king sat 20 feet away on his throne of carved obsidian and wolf skulls, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he's about to scrape off his boot. Alpha Draven Kael, ruler of the Northern Werewolf Empire, the man who'd brought 12 territories to heel through a combination of strategic brilliance and ruthless violence. His face was all hard angles and sharp edges, like someone had taken a knife to marble and carved out only the parts that could cut. Dark hair pulled back severe, eyes the color of winter storms, a jaw that looked like it had never softened for anything in its life. He was beautiful the way a weapon is beautiful. Efficient, deadly, cold. 3 years ago, he'd chosen her. Pulled her from obscurity with a glance across a crowded hall and declared her his mate in front of the entire court. She'd thought it was fate. Thought the moon had finally smiled on a girl who'd spent her whole life being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. She'd walked into this palace believing in destiny and second chances, and all the pretty lies people tell themselves when they're desperate to believe their suffering means something. She knew better now. Draven rose from his throne with the kind of controlled grace that made every movement look choreographed. The court held its collective breath. When the Alpha King stood, people paid attention. When he spoke, they obeyed. When he decided someone's fate, there was no appeal, no mercy, no room for negotiation. He was the law here. The beginning and the end. God and executioner rolled into one perfectly tailored package. His voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk, deep, measured, absolutely devoid of emotion. Lyra Virel, for 3 years you have held the title of Queen Consort of the Northern Empire. You have walked these halls, eaten at my table, slept in chambers reserved for royalty. You have been given every privilege, every comfort, every opportunity to prove yourself worthy of the position you were granted. Past tense. Every word in past tense. She felt something crack inside her chest, hairline fracture in the architecture of hope she'd been clinging to. He continued, each word falling like a hammer blow. And in those 3 years, you have produced nothing. No heirs, no political alliances of value, no demonstrations of power sufficient to justify your continued presence at my side. You have been, in every measurable way, a failure. The court stirred. Whispers rippled through the assembled nobles like wind through dead leaves. She could feel their satisfaction, their vindication. They'd been waiting for this. Some of them had been actively working toward it, poisoning wells and planting seeds of doubt in the king's ear whenever they could. Lady Seraphine with her serpent smile and strategic pregnancy rumors. Lord Castor with his perfectly timed reports of Lyra's inadequacies. The entire pack of them, circling and circling, waiting for the Alpha to finally acknowledge what they'd known all along. She didn't belong here. Lyra's throat felt like someone had packed it with sand. She forced herself to speak anyway, forced the words past the constriction and the humiliation and the rage that was starting to build behind her ribs like a pressure cooker about to blow. I have been loyal. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted, and she hated herself for it. I have stood beside you, supported every decision, defended your rule even when loyalty is the baseline expectation. Draven's interruption was surgical, precise. Not a virtue worthy of reward. A servant is loyal. A horse is loyal. I do not need loyalty from a queen. I need strength, vision, the capacity to rule in my absence and expand my power through your presence. You have provided none of these things. She wanted to scream. Wanted to list every late night she'd spent studying territory maps and trade agreements. Every social function she'd navigated alone because he was too busy conquering something new. Every time she'd bitten her tongue and smiled and played the role of perfect supportive mate while he treated her like furniture. Beautiful, decorative, ultimately replaceable, but screaming wouldn't change anything. This was a performance, and the ending had already been written. She was just a prop now, standing center stage while the real actors delivered their lines. Draven descended from the throne platform, boots clicking against marble with military precision. He stopped 5 feet away, close enough that she could see the absolute absence of conflict in his expression. No regret. No doubt. Just cold calculation and the kind of certainty that comes from a man who's never had to question his own decisions. I, Alpha Draven Kale, King of the Northern Werewolf Empire, Conqueror of the 12 territories, hereby formally reject you as my mate and queen. You are stripped of all titles, all privileges, all claims to this throne and this pack. You will be escorted from the palace within the hour. You will take nothing but the clothes you wear. You will speak of this to no one outside these walls. You will disappear into whatever obscurity spawned you, and you will be grateful I'm allowing you to leave with your life. The bond snapped. That's what everyone said happened during a rejection. The mystical connection between mates, that golden thread of destiny that supposedly bound two souls together across lifetimes and dimensions and all that romantic bullshit, it was supposed to snap like a broken guitar string. Lyra felt nothing. Maybe because there'd never been a bond to begin with. Maybe because whatever connection she'd imagined between them had been pure delusion from the start, her desperate heart manufacturing meaning from a powerful man's momentary interest. Maybe the moon had never blessed this union at all, and she'd just been too stupid and starry-eyed to see it. The court watched, waited. This was the part where she was supposed to break, collapse to her knees and beg for reconsideration, weep and wail and demonstrate exactly why she was too weak to stand beside an alpha king, give them the show they'd paid for. Something inside her shifted. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden surge of power or mystical awakening. Just a small, quiet realization settling into place like the final piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve for 3 years. She was done. Done performing. Done diminishing herself. Done swallowing her pride and her power and her entire goddamn personality to fit into a role that had been designed to make her fail from the beginning. Done begging for scraps of affection from a man who looked at her like a balance sheet that didn't add up. She lifted her chin, met Draven's storm-gray eyes with a steadiness that surprised her. When she spoke, her voice didn't shake. No. The single syllable dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Ripples spread. Heads turned. The king's expression flickered, just for a second, before smoothing back into that mask of absolute control. Excuse me? Lyra took a breath, felt her spine straighten, vertebra by vertebra, like a sword being drawn from its sheath. I said no. I reject your rejection. A collective intake of breath. Someone in the back actually gasped. Lord Castor looked like she'd just announced she was sprouting wings and flying to the moon. Draven's jaw tightened. That's not how this works. Isn't it? She was surprised by how calm she sounded. How clear. Like she'd been saving this voice for years, keeping it locked away for exactly this moment. You stood there and delivered your little speech about how inadequate I am, how I've failed to meet your impossible standards, how I'm not worthy of standing beside the great Alpha King. Fine. I heard you. But here's the thing you apparently didn't consider. Maybe I don't want to stand beside you anymore. Maybe spending 3 years watching you treat everyone around you like chess pieces has taught me exactly what kind of king you are, what kind of man you are. Why? His eyes went arctic. Careful. Or what? You'll reject me harder? She laughed, and it came out sharp and brittle and absolutely genuine. You're stripping me of everything and throwing me out like trash. What exactly do I have left to lose by telling you the truth? She took a step forward, then another. The crowd parted without realizing they were doing it, instinct pulling them back from something they couldn't quite name. She stopped 3 feet from the king, close enough to see the tiny muscle twitching in his jaw, the first crack in that perfect composure. I, Lyra Varel, reject you, Alpha Draven Kale, as my mate and king. I reject your empire built on fear and domination. I reject your court full of sycophants and cowards. I reject every moment I spent trying to be small enough, quiet enough, perfect enough to earn your approval. And I especially reject the lie that any of this was about me failing you, when the truth is, you never gave me a real chance to succeed. The room had gone so quiet she could hear the crackling of torches in their wall sconces, could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could hear Draven's breath just slightly faster than normal, the only sign that she'd actually landed a hit. His voice dropped to something dangerous. You have no idea what you've just done. I know exactly what I've done. She held his gaze, refusing to flinch. I've stopped pretending this was ever about love or fate or destiny. You chose me because you thought I'd be easy to control. A pretty face with no power, no connections, no ability to challenge you. The perfect decorative queen. And when I didn't give you the strategic heirs you wanted fast enough, when I didn't prove useful in expanding your empire, you decided to discard me. That's fine. I'll make it easier for you. She took the silver circlet from her hair, the thin crown she'd worn every day for 3 years, and dropped it at his feet. It hit the marble with a sharp clink that echoed through the chamber. Keep your throne. Keep your empire. Keep your court full of people who smile at your face and sharpen knives behind your back. I don't need any of it. I don't need you. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The king and the rejected queen stood locked in a battle that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with will, and the entire court held its collective breath waiting to see who would break first. Draven's hand shot out faster than thought, fingers closing around her throat. Not squeezing, not yet, just holding, making a point about power and who wielded it here. His voice came out in a growl that raised the hair on her arms. You will regret this. Lyra smiled. It felt wrong on her face, too sharp and too cold, nothing like the soft diplomatic smiles she'd practiced for years. Probably, but at least I'll regret it on my own terms. She reached up and wrapped her fingers around his wrist. For a second, she thought he might actually squeeze, might crush her windpipe right there in front of everyone just to prove he could. The violence was there in his eyes, barely leashed. She saw it clearly. The part of him that was pure predator, pure alpha dominance, that wanted to put her back in her place through the most primal means available. But he didn't. Because that would mean she'd gotten to him, would mean she'd cracked that legendary control everyone whispered about in odd tones. He released her and stepped back, straightening his jacket with deliberate precision. When he spoke again, his voice was back to that cold, measured tone, the mask firmly in place. Exile. Effective immediately. You will be escorted to the border and released with nothing. No money, no provisions, no protection. If you are found within the territory of the Northern Empire after sunset tomorrow, you will be executed as a traitor. Your name will be struck from all records. Your family will be barred from court. Anyone who offers you aid or shelter will be considered an enemy of the crown. He turned to address the court, dismissing her with his posture. Let this be a lesson. Defiance is not courage. It is stupidity, and stupidity has consequences. Guards materialized on either side of her, hands on her arms, not gentle. She didn't resist, didn't give them the satisfaction of dragging her out kicking and screaming. She walked, head high, spine straight, forcing them to match her pace instead of hauling her along like a prisoner. As she passed through the massive doors of the throne room, she caught sight of faces in the crowd. Lady Seraphine practically glowing with triumph, Lord Castor already calculating how to capitalize on this shift in power. The younger courtiers, wide-eyed and whispering, storing away every detail to gossip about later. And in the back, half hidden in shadow, a figure she almost didn't recognize. Older, female, dressed in the simple robes of a palace servant, but standing with a stillness that suggested anything but servitude. Their eyes met for just a second, and the woman inclined her head in something that looked almost like acknowledgement. Then Lyra was through the doors, and the throne room was behind her, and the only sound was her own footsteps echoing down marble hallways. She'd walked 1,000 times, but would never walk again. The guards didn't speak. Neither did she. What was there to say? She'd burned every bridge she had in the most public way possible. There was no going back, no undoing what she'd done. In the span of 10 minutes, she'd gone from queen consort of a vast empire to exiled nobody with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever defiant pride she'd managed to scrape together. Stupid. He was right about that. It was stupid. Suicidal, even. She had no plan, no allies, no resources. She'd just thrown everything away for the sake of her pride, for the satisfaction of seeing that flicker of surprise in Draven's eyes when she said no. Was it worth it? She thought about 3 years of biting her tongue. 3 years of making herself smaller, quieter, less threatening. 3 years of watching her own reflection in mirrors and windows and polished floors and not recognizing the woman staring back. 3 years of dying by inches while everyone around her pretended not to notice she was already a ghost. Yeah, it was worth it. It was. They took her to her chambers, gave her 5 minutes to change out of her formal gown into something practical. She chose leather pants, a simple tunic, boots designed for walking rather than appearance, looked around at the room that had been her prison disguised as paradise. The massive bed with its silk sheets, the wardrobe full of dresses she'd never chosen. The vanity covered in cosmetics and jewels that had never quite felt like hers. She took nothing, left it all exactly as it was, like a museum exhibit of a life that had never really belonged to her anyway. The guards escorted her through back corridors, avoiding the main halls where courtiers might see and gawk. Even in exile, there were protocols. Appearances to maintain. Can't have the common servant seeing a queen dragged out in disgrace. Might give them ideas. They brought her to the northern gate, the one that led out into the wilderness beyond the cultivated palace grounds. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. Appropriate. The guard captain, a grizzled man named Marcus who'd always been marginally less hostile than the others, looked at her with something that might have been pity, might have been respect. Hard to tell. You got anywhere to go? Lyra looked out at the darkening forest beyond the gate. Miles of untamed wilderness, full of things that would happily kill a lone woman with no weapons and no pack for protection. Not really, Marcus grunted. Reached into his jacket and pulled out a small knife in a worn leather sheath, held it out. Officially, I searched you and found this on your person, confiscated it as contraband. You'll note it's not in my report. She took it, fingers closing around the hilt. It wasn't much. Would barely do more than irritate anything serious that came for her, but it was something. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just survive. Heard what you said in there about the king needing people to challenge him. He lowered his voice, glancing back to make sure the other guards weren't listening. You're not wrong. Place is rotting from the inside. Someone needs to do something about it. Probably won't be you, but hell, at least you tried. He stepped back, signaling the others to open the gate. The iron hinges groaned, swinging wide to reveal the forest beyond. Dark, deep, full of unknown dangers and zero guarantees, Lyra stepped through. The gate clanged shut behind her with a finality that resonated in her bones. She stood there for a moment, listening to the sounds of the forest waking up for the night, rustling in the underbrush, distant howls that might have been wolves or might have been something worse. The wind picking up, carrying the scent of pine and earth and freedom. She had no plan, no destination, no idea what the hell she was going to do or how she was going to survive. The smart thing would be to head for one of the smaller territories, try to blend in, find work as a servant or a laborer. Keep her head down, live quiet, live small, live safe. The smart thing. Lyra started walking. Not toward any of the known territories, not toward civilization or safety or sense. She walked deeper into the wilderness, into the parts of the map marked with warnings and rumors, where the old magic still lived and the rules were written in blood and survival instead of politics and protocol. If she was going to die out here, at least it would be on her own terms. At least it would be honest. Better than dying slowly in a palace, suffocated by expectations and appearances and the weight of a crown that never fit right. She walked until her feet hurt and the palace was lost behind miles of trees. Walked until the moon rose full and bright, lighting the forest floor in silver. Walked until she found a small clearing with a stream running through it, cold and clear and speaking in the language of water over stones. She knelt by the stream, cupped her hands, and drank. The water tasted like ice and earth and something wild she didn't have a name for. It burned going down like swallowing lightning, and for a second she wondered if she'd just poisoned herself on some kind of magical runoff. Then the burning spread. Not painful, just intense. Like every cell in her body waking up at once, remembering something it had forgotten or never knew it had lost. Her reflection in the water rippled and shifted, and for just a second she saw something else looking back at her. Someone else. Eyes that glowed silver, features that were hers but sharper, stronger, more defined. Then it was gone, and she was just Lyra again. Alone in the woods, exiled, rejected, probably dying, but not dead yet. She made camp in the clearing, using fallen branches and moss to build a crude shelter against the base of a large oak. No fire. Couldn't risk the smoke attracting attention. Just her and the knife Marcus had given her and the moonlight filtering through leaves overhead. She should have been terrified. Should have been crying or panicking or regretting every choice that led her to this moment. Instead, she felt something else. Something she couldn't quite name but recognized in her bones. Possibility. For 3 years, her life had been written by someone else. Every move choreographed, every word scripted, every version of herself carefully curated to meet someone else's expectations. And she'd failed anyway. Failed to be the perfect queen, the perfect mate, the perfect decorative addition to a powerful man's empire. But maybe that was the point. Maybe she'd been trying to fit into a story that was never meant for her. Maybe the real failure was thinking she needed to shrink herself down to fit in someone else's kingdom instead of building her own. The thought should have been ridiculous. She had nothing. Was nothing. A rejected queen with no pack, no power, no prospects. What kind of kingdom could someone like that possibly build? But in the darkness of the forest, with the moon overhead and something ancient stirring in her blood, Lyra allowed herself to wonder, to imagine. To dream bigger than she'd let herself dream in years. She fell asleep planning, not kingdoms or empires or grand revenge, just the next day. How to find food, how to build a real shelter, how to survive long enough to figure out who she actually was beneath all the roles she'd played and the masks she'd worn. Survival first. Everything else could wait. The moon watched. The forest listened. And something old and patient smiled in the spaces between heartbeats, recognizing the birth of something it had been waiting a very long time to see. Far away, in his obsidian throne room, Draven Kyle sat alone in the dark. He'd dismissed the court hours ago, sent everyone away with orders not to disturb him. The crown sat on the arm of his throne, heavy and cold, and everything he'd ever wanted. Everything he'd ever sacrificed for. He thought about the look in Lyra's eyes when she'd dropped her circlet at his feet. That moment of perfect defiance, when she'd stopped being the nervous girl trying desperately to please him and became something else. Something he hadn't expected. Something he'd maybe never actually seen before. He told himself it didn't matter. She was gone. Problem solved. He'd find a new queen, someone more suitable, someone who understood power and how to wield it, someone worthy of standing beside a king. But the throne room felt emptier than usual, and when he closed his eyes, all he could see was her walking away, spine straight and head high, like she'd won instead of lost. It bothered him more than it should. He'd crushed rebellions, conquered territories, broken alphas twice her size without breaking a sweat. One defiant woman shouldn't have lodged under his skin like a splinter he couldn't dig out. Tomorrow, she'd be someone else's problem. Or dead. Either way, not his concern. He repeated it like a mantra until he almost believed it. Almost. In the forest, Lyra dreamed of silver eyes and voices speaking languages she didn't know but somehow understood. Dreamed of power that tasted like moonlight and felt like coming home. Dreamed of the moment when Draven's hand had wrapped around her throat, and instead of fear, she'd felt something else. Recognition. Not of him, of herself. Of the thing sleeping in her blood that had finally started to wake up. When she opened her eyes at dawn, the world looked different, sharper, more vivid, like someone had turned up the contrast and saturation on reality itself. She could hear things she shouldn't be able to hear. The heartbeat of a rabbit 50 yards away, the rustle of an owl settling into its daytime roost, the distant rush of a larger river beyond the stream. She held up her hands. They looked the same, but they felt different, steadier, stronger. Like they belonged to someone who knew how to fight instead of someone who'd spent 3 years learning how to curtsy. Lyra stood, brushed the dirt and leaves from her clothes, and looked around the clearing that had been her sanctuary for one night. Time to move. Time to find out what happened next. Time to become whoever she was supposed to be when nobody was watching. Behind her, in the palace she'd left behind, the servants found her chambers exactly as she'd left them. Bed made, wardrobe untouched, vanity neat and organized, like she'd simply vanished into thin air instead of being thrown out like garbage. But on the mirror, written in what looked like frost despite the warm morning, someone found words that hadn't been there the night before. This isn't over. Nobody could explain it. Nobody wanted to try. They cleaned it away quickly before anyone important could see, before it could become a rumor or a symbol or anything more than a weird coincidence. But the words had been there, and somewhere, in a forest that didn't appear on any official map, Lyra Virel smiled without knowing why and started walking toward a destiny that had been waiting for her all along. The game had changed. The pieces were moving, and the rejected queen had just made the first move in a war nobody saw coming. The forest didn't care about her problems. Didn't care that she was royalty in exile, or that her feet were already blistering, or that she had no idea where the hell she was going. The trees just kept growing, indifferent and ancient, while she stumbled through undergrowth that grabbed at her clothes like it wanted to pull her down into the earth. By midday, Lyra was questioning every decision that had led her here. The defiance had felt good in the moment. Standing in that throne room, dropping her crown at Draven's feet, watching his perfect control crack just enough to let something human peek through. That had been worth it. That moment of pure fuck you to a man who thought he owned her soul just because he'd put a ring on her finger and a title next to her name. But defiance didn't fill an empty stomach, didn't make the wilderness any less hostile, didn't change the fact that she was alone in territory she didn't know with skills she didn't have, and a future that looked a whole lot like dying slowly of exposure or getting eaten by something with bigger teeth. She found a berry bush around noon, stared at the small purple fruits clustered on thorny branches, and tried to remember if she'd ever learned which wild berries were safe to eat. Court education had covered etiquette, languages, diplomatic protocol, how to smile while someone insulted you to your face. Wilderness survival hadn't made the curriculum. Her stomach growled. She picked one berry, rolled it between her fingers. It looked harmless, smelled sweet, could be perfectly safe. Could also shut down her kidneys in 6 hours. This is what pride gets you, she thought, alone in the woods playing Russian roulette with fruit. She ate it anyway. Then another, then a handful. If they killed her, at least she wouldn't die hungry. There were worse ways to go. The berries sat in her stomach like lead, and she waited for poison to kick in, for her vision to blur or her throat to close or whatever horrible death she'd just chosen. But nothing happened. Just the normal discomfort of eating after not eating, her body trying to figure out what to do with actual fuel. Small victories. She kept walking. The stream she'd camped beside last night had grown into a proper creek, and she followed it because moving water meant civilization eventually. Meant people. Meant towns where she could maybe find work or steal food or do whatever desperate exiles did when they ran out of options. The thing nobody tells you about being an alpha's mate is that it hollows you out. Not all at once. Slowly. Like water wearing down stone. Every time you bite your tongue instead of speaking. Every time you make yourself smaller to fit someone else's expectations. Every time you watch yourself disappear a little more in the mirror and tell yourself it's worth it because love requires sacrifice. Except it wasn't love. That's what Lyra was starting to understand as she walked. Love doesn't demand you erase yourself. Power does. Control does. Dominance does. Draven had never loved her. He'd acquired her, like he acquired territories and titles and anything else that made him look more powerful, more complete, more like the perfect alpha king everyone expected. And she'd let him. Participated in her own erasure because the alternative was admitting she'd made a mistake. That the moon hadn't blessed their union. That destiny was bullshit, and she'd just been a convenient choice for a king who needed a pretty face beside him. Pride. That's what it came down to. She'd been too proud to admit she'd been used. Too proud to walk away when she still had the chance. Too invested in the fairy tale version of her own life to see the reality staring her in the face. Now she was paying for it, lost in the wilderness with nothing but regrets and a knife that wouldn't do shit against anything serious. The creek led to a river. The river led to a gorge. The gorge led to a waterfall that dropped 50 feet into a pool so clear she could see straight to the bottom. Lyra stood at the edge, looking down at water that probably hadn't seen a human in years, and felt something shift in her chest. This was beautiful, raw and wild and completely indifferent to human concerns. No politics here, no power plays or careful words or strategic smiles, just water and stone and the endless patient work of nature carving the world into new shapes. She sat on a flat rock overlooking the pool and let herself breathe. Really breathe. Not the careful, controlled breaths of a woman trying to take up less space. Deep gulps of air that filled her lungs and reminded her body it was still alive, still functional, still capable of more than she'd let it be for 3 years. The sun was setting. She needed to find shelter, needed to think about fire and food and all the practical concerns of staying alive another night. But for just a minute, she let herself sit and watch the light change and feel something other than anger or fear or the crushing weight of having thrown away everything familiar. She felt free, terrified, lost, probably dying, but free. The sound of branches snapping yanked her back to reality. She was on her feet in a second, knife out, heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. Something was moving through the trees, something big enough to make noise, which meant either very dangerous or very stupid. A wolf emerged from the tree line, not a shifter, an actual wolf, gray and white with eyes that gleamed yellow in the fading light. It stopped at the edge of the clearing 20 feet away and stared at her with the kind of intelligence that made her skin crawl. Lyra's hand tightened on the knife, completely useless against a predator that size, but holding it made her feel slightly less helpless. The wolf didn't move, just watched her with those unsettling eyes, head tilted slightly like it was trying to figure out what the hell she was doing out here alone. Good question. They stood there, frozen in mutual assessment, predator and prey trying to decide if the other was worth the trouble. Lyra's training kicked in. Don't run. Running triggers the chase instinct. Don't break eye contact. Don't show fear even though your hands are shaking and your heart is trying to punch through your sternum. The wolf took a step forward, then another, closing the distance with the kind of deliberate patience that said it had all the time in the world and she wasn't going anywhere. This is it, she thought. Rejected by a king, killed by a wolf. At least it'll be over quick. The wolf stopped 5 feet away, close enough that she could see the individual hairs in its coat, the slight graying around its muzzle that suggested age. It sat, just dropped its haunches to the ground and continued staring at her like she was the most fascinating thing it had seen all week. Then it yawned, showing teeth that could tear her throat out without effort, a casual reminder of exactly how this would go if it decided she looked like dinner. But it didn't attack, didn't growl or bare its teeth in aggression, just sat there, watching her with those 2 intelligent eyes while the last light bled out of the sky and the forest settled into twilight. Lyra lowered the knife, slowly, not sheathing it, but pointing it at the ground instead of the wolf, a peace offering of sorts. I won't start something if you don't. The wolf's tail twitched. Once. Might have been acknowledgement, might have been coincidence, hard to tell with predators. Then it stood, turned, and walked away. Just like that. Back into the trees, like the whole encounter had been a weird dream her exhausted brain had conjured to make the isolation more interesting. Lyra stood there shaking, adrenaline draining out of her system and leaving her legs weak. What the hell had that been? Wolves didn't just approach humans and sit down for a staring contest. They attacked or they ran. They didn't stage philosophical encounters by waterfalls at sunset, unless it hadn't been a normal wolf. The thought settled in her gut like ice. Shifters could hold partial transformations, could walk the line between human and wolf, keeping enough of their animal form to pass as the real thing while retaining human intelligence. She'd seen it done at court, usually as a party trick or a demonstration of control. Had someone followed her? Was Draven having her watched to make sure she actually left the territory? Or worse, having her hunted for sport, turning her exile into entertainment for whatever sick nobles got off on that kind of thing? Paranoia, probably. She was alone and scared, and her mind was manufacturing threats because the reality of being hunted was somehow easier to process than the reality of being completely, utterly abandoned. She forced herself to move. Made camp in a small cave she found near the waterfall, sheltered enough to hide a fire, but open enough that nothing could corner her inside. She managed to get a flame going using dry moss, and the friction method she'd read about once in a book and never thought she'd actually need. The fire was small. Pathetic, really, but it was hers. Built with her own hands, feeding on wood she'd gathered herself, warming a space she'd claimed without asking permission from anyone. She roasted the last of the berries, which made them taste worse, but at least felt like cooking. Drank water straight from the river and didn't even care if it gave her dysentery. Sat with her back against stone and watched shadows dance on the cave walls while her mind raced through everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. She'd destroyed her life. Burned every bridge, severed every connection, thrown away security and status, and everything most people spent their whole lives working toward. For what? Pride? Spite? The temporary satisfaction of seeing surprise on a man's face? But sitting there in her pathetic cave with her pathetic fire and her pathetic berries, Lyra couldn't make herself regret it. Couldn't make herself wish she'd stayed quiet, accepted the rejection gracefully, disappeared into obscurity without making a scene. Because that version of herself was dead, had been dying for 3 years, suffocated by expectations and appearances and the slow crushing weight of trying to be someone she wasn't. What walked out of that palace wasn't the same girl who'd walked in 3 years ago believing in fairy tales and happy endings. This version was harder, angrier, more honest. And yeah, currently homeless and probably dying, but at least dying as herself instead of as someone's decorative failure. She fell asleep listening to the waterfall, and thinking about wolves with 2 intelligent eyes. The dream came immediately. She was standing in the throne room again, but it was different. Empty. The chandeliers were dark, the torches unlit. Just moonlight streaming through windows that shouldn't exist, painting everything in silver and shadow. Draven sat on his throne, but he looked younger, less controlled. His eyes tracked her movements with something that looked almost like hunger. Come here. She didn't remember walking, but suddenly she was standing in front of him, close enough to touch, close enough to see the pulse in his throat, steady and strong, and absolutely certain of its own power. You think you can survive without me? I don't need you. His hand shot out, grabbed her wrist, pulled her down until they were eye to eye. You have no idea what you've done, what you've unleashed. Then his eyes went silver. Not metaphorically, actually silver. Glowing with a light that had nothing to do with reflection. And when he smiled, his teeth were too sharp, too white, more wolf than man. The smart ones know when they're prey. Lyra woke up gasping, sweat cooling on her skin despite the fire dying to embers. Just a dream. Just her exhausted mind processing trauma and fear and the general mindfuck of the last day. Nothing meaningful, nothing real. But her wrist ached where Dream Draven had grabbed it. She checked. No mark, no bruise, just phantom pain and the lingering sense that something had reached across the distance between them and reminded her that exile didn't mean forgotten. Dawn came cold and gray. She put out the fire, drank more river water, ate more berries that her stomach was starting to actively protest. Then she kept walking, following the river because it was better than standing still, better than thinking too hard about wolves and dreams and the fact that she was on day 2 of exile with no plan beyond survive until tomorrow. The river widened. The forest thinned. By midday, she could see smoke in the distance, the telltale sign of human habitation. A village, maybe. Or a camp. Somewhere with people who might have food or information or at least directions to the nearest territory border. She almost cried with relief. The smart move would be to clean up first. Find a way to look less like a feral exile and more like a traveler who'd had some bad luck. But she was too hungry and too tired to care about appearances. She just walked toward the smoke and hoped whoever it belonged to was the kind of people who helped strangers instead of killing them. The camp was smaller than she expected, maybe 20 people, scattered between crude shelters that looked temporary. Hunters, probably. Or trappers. People who made their living in the wilderness and knew how to survive it. They saw her coming. Hard not to. She was limping by then, feet screaming in boots that hadn't been designed for miles of rough terrain. A woman stepped forward, older, with scars on her arms, and the kind of stance that said she knew how to use the knife on her belt. You lost? Lyra almost laughed. Yeah, you could say that. The woman looked her over, taking in the expensive clothes gone filthy, the empty hands, the desperation that was probably written all over her face. You running from something or to something? Does it matter? Usually. The woman's eyes were sharp, assessing, saw too much. We don't want trouble. Got enough of our own out here. I'm not trouble. Lyra straightened her spine, tried to find some dignity in the wreckage of herself. I just need food and maybe directions to the nearest settlement. The woman was quiet for a long moment, then she gestured toward the camp. Got rabbit stew. You can have some if you work for it. Need help processing pelts. It was the nicest offer anyone had made her in years. Lyra felt something crack in her chest, relief and gratitude, and the horrible vulnerability of being completely dependent on the kindness of strangers. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The woman started walking back to camp. Name's Kara, and before you ask, yeah, we know who you are. Word travels fast when a queen gets exiled. Lyra stopped walking. Of course they knew. Probably the whole empire knew by now. Draven's rejection of the inadequate queen who dared to reject him back. Entertainment for the masses. A cautionary tale about knowing your place. Kara glanced back. You coming or not? Stew won't stay hot forever. She followed. What choice did she have? Pride was expensive, and she'd spent all of hers yesterday in a throne room. Today was about survival, and survival meant swallowing whatever was left of her dignity and accepting help from people who had every reason to turn her away. The camp was rougher up close. Shelters made from branches and animal hides, fire pits ringed with stones, tools that looked homemade and well used. But it was clean, organized. The kind of place where people knew what they were doing and didn't waste energy on anything unnecessary. Kara handed her a bowl of stew that smelled like heaven and tasted even better. Lyra tried to eat slowly, tried not to wolf it down like an animal, but hunger won. She finished the bowl in minutes, barely tasting it, her body just grateful for actual food. The others watched, not hostile exactly, more curious, like she was an exotic animal that had wandered into camp and they weren't sure if it was dangerous or just interesting. A man approached, younger than Kara, but with the same weathered look that came from years of outdoor living. You really reject the Alpha King to his face? Lyra set down the empty bowl. Yeah. Why? The question was so direct it caught her off guard. Why? Like there was a good reason, like it made sense, like defiance was something you could justify with logic instead of just gut instinct and accumulated rage. Because I was tired of being small. The man nodded like that made perfect sense. Then he smiled, showing teeth that had gaps where some were missing. Good for you. Bastard needed someone to tell him no. Kara shot him a look. Careful. Talking like that gets you killed. We're already out here because we won't play his game. Might as well speak the truth. The man looked back at Lyra. You got anywhere to go or are you just wandering until you die? Haven't decided yet. Well, if you survive long enough to figure it out, you should head south. Borderlands, where all the rejects end up. People who don't fit in the Empire's neat little boxes. She'd probably blend right in. Lyra felt something stir in her chest. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. A direction that wasn't just away from Draven, but toward something. Somewhere she might actually belong, instead of just survive. How far south? 3 weeks on foot if you know what you're doing. The man shrugged. 6 if you don't, assuming you don't get killed on the way. Kara handed Lyra a knife, smaller than the one Marcus had given her, but sharper. Start with that pile of pelts. Scrape the flesh off clean. I'll show you how. They spent the afternoon working. Kara taught her the rhythm of the scraping blade, how to hold the pelt taut, how to tell when it was clean enough. The work was disgusting. Her hands were covered in blood and fat and bits of tissue she tried not to think about. But it was honest, real. The kind of labor that had nothing to do with politics or appearances or being someone you weren't. Around the fire that night, the hunters shared stories. Who they'd been before they'd ended up out here. Kara had been a pack enforcer until she'd questioned an order and gotten exiled for insubordination. The young man, whose name was Cole, had been a merchant's son who refused an arranged mating. Others had similar stories. People who'd stepped out of line in small ways and learned the hard way that the Empire didn't tolerate deviation. They were all exiles, all rejects, all people who'd chosen something other than obedience and paid for it. Lyra listened and felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. She wasn't alone, wasn't the only one who'd looked at the system and said no, even knowing the consequences. There were others, not many, maybe, but enough. Enough to fill a camp. Enough to survive in the wilderness. Enough to build something different if they wanted to. You planning to go after him? Cole asked around a mouthful of dried meat. The king? Get revenge or whatever. Lyra thought about it. The honest answer was she hadn't thought past surviving the next day. Revenge felt like a luxury for people who had resources and plans and more than one change of clothes. I don't know. You should. Cole leaned forward, eyes bright with the kind of intensity that came from deeply held grudges. Bastards like him don't stop until someone stops them. He'll just keep crushing people until someone crushes him back. And you think I'm that someone? Could be. You already got his attention. Might as well use it. Kara threw a stick at Cole. Leave her alone. She just got here. Doesn't need you filling her head with suicide missions. But Cole wasn't wrong. That was the thing. Draven wouldn't forget what she'd done. Wouldn't just let it go and move on. Men like him didn't work that way. The rejection in front of his entire court, the public defiance, the crack in his perfect control. That was an insult he'd have to address eventually, either by hunting her down and making an example, or by making sure everyone knew she had died badly in exile. She wasn't safe. Wouldn't be safe. Not until he was dead or she was too far away to matter. Going south started to sound less like possibility and more like necessity. She stayed with the camp for 3 days, working, learning, building back strength in muscles that had gone soft from years of court life. Kara taught her how to set snares, how to read tracks, how to move through the forest without making noise. Cole taught her dirty fighting, the kind that had nothing to do with honor and everything to do with staying alive when someone bigger wanted you dead. On the third night, Kara pulled her aside. You need to leave tomorrow. Lyra's stomach dropped. Why? I thought. You're bringing attention we can't afford. Had scouts from the capital sniffing around this morning, looking for an exiled queen. The woman's face was grim. We sent them the wrong direction, but they'll be back, and we can't protect you if they come in force. So this was it. 3 days of something almost like community, and now back to being alone. Back to being a liability nobody could afford. I understand. Lyra kept her voice steady. Thank you for what you've done. I won't forget it. Kara pressed something into her hand. A small pouch, heavy with coins. It's not much, but it'll get you supplies in a border town. And this, she handed over a worn map, edges frayed from use. Shows the safe route south. Avoid the marked areas. That's where the King's patrols run. Why are you helping me? Because someone helped me once, when I needed it. The woman's expression softened just slightly, and because watching you tell that bastard no was the best thing I've seen in years. Don't waste it. Lyra left at dawn with a pack full of supplies she hadn't earned and directions to a place she'd never heard of. The hunters watched her go in silence, and she wondered if they were relieved or disappointed or just indifferent. Hard to tell with people who'd learned to keep their feelings locked down tight. The map was good, detailed. It showed water sources and shelter spots and the territories to avoid if you valued your life. She followed it south, moving faster now that she had proper food and gear, stopping only to sleep and eat and check that she wasn't being followed. On the 5th day, she saw the patrol. 5 wolves moving through the forest in formation, too organized to be wild. Draven's men, hunting for something, hunting for her. Lyra dropped flat behind a fallen log, heart hammering so loud she was sure they'd hear it. The wolves passed within 20 feet, so close she could smell them, that distinctive pack scent that all shifters carried. They were searching, methodical, professional. One of them stopped, lifted its head, scenting the air. She held her breath, pressing herself into the earth, willing herself to be invisible. The wolf's eyes swept the area, yellow and cold and absolutely focused. Then it moved on, following the others deeper into the forest, away from her hiding spot. She waited until they were gone, then waited longer. Then finally, carefully, slowly, started moving again. Off the trail this time. through the rough terrain where patrols wouldn't bother looking because nobody sane would travel that way. Nobody sane. But she'd left sane behind in a throne room when she'd dropped her crown and walked away from everything safe. The borderlands appeared gradually. Not a clear line, but a slow transition from empire control to something wilder, less organized. The trees grew differently here, twisted and gnarled, like they'd learned to survive in soil that nobody else wanted. The air tasted different, sharper, more honest. She found the town on the map 3 weeks after leaving the hunter's camp. It wasn't much. A collection of buildings that looked one strong wind away from collapse, inhabited by people who looked the same way. But it was outside Empire territory, outside Draven's reach. Safe, or as close to safe as she was going to get. Lyra walked down the main street with her head up and her hand on her knife, ready for whatever came next. People stared. She stared back, letting them see that she wasn't afraid, wasn't running, wasn't going to apologize for existing in their space. A woman stepped out of what looked like a tavern, wiping her hands on a dirty apron. "You looking for work or trouble?" "Work. Good. We need someone who can fight. Raiders hit us twice last month. Could use another body on the walls." The woman looked her over critically. "You any good?" "I'm learning." The woman snorted. "Honest, at least. Name's Mara. Come inside. We'll figure out if you're worth feeding." Lyra followed her into the tavern, into the smell of old beer and cooking meat and unwashed bodies, into a new life that looked nothing like the one she'd lost, into the unknown with nothing but a knife and the stubborn refusal to give up that had kept her alive this long. Behind her, miles away in his palace, Draven stood at a window overlooking his empire. The scouts had returned empty-handed again. 3 weeks of searching and the exiled queen had vanished like smoke, either dead or smart enough to stay hidden. He told himself it didn't matter. She was gone. Problem solved. Time to move on to more important concerns. But at night, he dreamed of silver eyes and a voice that said no. And when he woke, he found himself wondering not if she'd survived, but what she'd become out there in the wild places where his control didn't reach. In the borderlands, Lyra learned to fight for real, learned to kill without hesitation, learned that the girl who'd walked out of the palace was gone, and what was left was something harder, sharper, more dangerous than anyone had expected, including herself. And far to the north, in forests that didn't appear on any map, the wolf with gray-white fur and 2 intelligent eyes watched the moon rise and smiled with teeth that could tear out throats. The game was just beginning. 6 months in the borderlands taught Lyra things the palace never could. How to read a room for threats instead of politics. How to move through a crowd without being seen. How to kill a man twice her size if he grabbed wrong or pushed too hard or decided that an exiled queen was fair game for whatever sick fantasy he'd been nursing. She'd killed 3 men in those 6 months. Quick, brutal, necessary. The first one had haunted her for weeks, his face showing up in dreams, his blood on her hands no matter how many times she washed them. The second one barely registered. By the third, she felt nothing at all except relief that it was him bleeding out in the dirt instead of her. That's what survival does. It sands down the soft parts until all that's left is edges sharp enough to cut back. The town had accepted her the way borderland towns accepted everyone. Suspicion first, then grudging tolerance, then eventually just another face in the crowd of misfits and exiles. She worked the walls during raids, fought beside people whose names she barely knew, learned that loyalty here wasn't about bonds or pack mentality. It was transactional. You kept them alive, they kept you alive, and nobody asked questions about who you used to be. Mara had become something like a friend, as close to friendship as happened in places where everyone was running from something. The tavern keeper was gruff, practical, and had the kind of past she never talked about but showed itself in scars and the way she flinched at loud noises. They'd formed an understanding built on mutual respect and the shared knowledge that the world had chewed them up and spit them out, and they'd survived anyway. So when Mara called her into the back room one evening, expression grim, Lyra knew something had shifted. "Got visitors asking about you." Mara kept her voice low. 3 of them. Well-dressed. Well-armed. Not from around here. Lyra's hand went to her knife automatically. "Empire? Don't think so. They're not wearing colors. But they knew your name. Asked if the exiled queen had passed through." Mara's eyes were worried in a way Lyra rarely saw. "I told them we don't keep track of people's business here. They didn't believe me." Where are they now? Still in the main room, drinking, watching the door like they're expecting someone. The woman crossed her arms. You need to leave. Tonight. Out the back. I'll cover your trail. The smart move. Run. Keep running. Stay ahead of whatever Draven had sent after her, whether it was death or politics or something worse. She'd gotten good at running in 6 months. Good at disappearing. Good at being nobody in places where nobody cared. But something in her chest had hardened over those months. Something that was tired of running. Tired of looking over her shoulder. Tired of letting fear make her decisions. No. Lyra's voice came out steady. I'm done hiding. That's stupid. Probably. But I need to know what they want. Who sent them? She met Mara's eyes. If it goes bad, don't get involved. This isn't your fight. Everything that happens in my tavern is my fight. Mara pulled a small crossbow from under the bar, checked the bolt. But it's your call. Try not to bleed on my floors. Lyra walked back into the main room with her spine straight and her hand loose at her side, ready to draw if needed. The 3 visitors weren't hard to spot. They sat at a corner table, too clean for the borderlands, too composed, watching her with the kind of attention that said they'd been waiting. The one in the middle stood, female, late 30s maybe, with dark hair pulled back severe and eyes that assessed like she was calculating exactly how many seconds it would take to kill everyone in the room, if necessary. She gestured to an empty chair. Lyra Virele? We've been looking for you. Congratulations. You found me. Lyra didn't sit. What do you want? To talk. The woman's voice was cultured, educated, Northern Territory accent but not capital, somewhere on the borders of the empire. We represent certain interests who believe you might be valuable. I'm not interested in being valuable to anyone, even if it means bringing down the king who threw you away. The question hit harder than it should have. Lyra kept her expression neutral, refusing to let them see the spike of interest, the visceral satisfaction the idea gave her. She'd spent 6 months trying not to think about Draven, trying not to imagine his face when he heard she'd survived, trying not to feed the anger that burned in her chest every time she remembered standing in that throne room while he erased her like she was nothing. Keep talking. The woman smiled. Thin. Professional. My name is Vera. These are my associates, Kane and Lyris. We work for a coalition of nobles who are tired of King Draven's expanding territory grabs and increasingly autocratic rule. They want change. They want someone who can challenge him from a position he won't expect. And you think that's me? An exiled nobody with no pack, no power, no resources? You're not nobody. Vera leaned forward slightly. You're the queen he rejected publicly, the woman who rejected him back. That makes you a symbol. And symbols have power when used correctly. Here's what power really is. Not crowns or titles or the ability to command armies. Those are tools. Mechanisms. The machinery of control, but not power itself. Real power is what people believe, what they invest in, what they're willing to die for or kill to protect. A king's power comes from the collective agreement that he's powerful. Break that agreement, and the crown becomes just expensive metal on a head that bleeds same as anyone else. These nobles understood that. They'd seen Lyra break the agreement in a throne room 6 months ago, seen her refuse to play her assigned role, refuse to accept the narrative Draven had written, where she was weak and he was inevitable. And now they wanted to weaponize that moment, turn her defiance into revolution. Smart, dangerous. Probably going to get everyone involved killed. She was listening. What exactly are you proposing? Vera pulled out a map, spread it on the table. These territories here are experiencing unrest, heavy taxes, forced conscription. Draven's been pulling resources to fund his expansion east, and people are suffering for it. We've been quietly supporting resistance movements. Small stuff. Sabotage. Disruption. But it's not enough. They need leadership, a figure they can rally behind, someone who's already proven she won't bow to the Alpha King. Exactly. And what do your noble backers get out of this? Leverage. When Draven's forced to deal with rebellion in his own territories, he can't expand outward. His attention gets split, his resources stretched thin. It creates opportunities for those who know how to use them. So I'd be a distraction, a tool to weaken him while they make their own plays for power. Vera didn't deny it. That's politics. Everyone uses everyone. The question is whether you get something you want out of it. Lyra looked at the map. at the territories marked in red, places she'd never been, people she'd never met, lives that would be destroyed if this went wrong, and probably destroyed anyway if it went right because rebellions were ugly and brutal and soaked in blood regardless of who won. But the alternative was staying here, hiding, surviving but not living, waiting for Draven to eventually remember she existed and send someone competent to finish what exile had started. At least this way she'd be moving forward. At least this way she'd hit back. I want full tactical control. No interference from your nobles. They fund and supply, I run the operation. Lyra's voice was hard. And I want to guarantee that if this works, the territories we liberate don't just become new property for your coalition to carve up. Vera considered. The guarantee I can't give you. Politics doesn't work that way. But tactical control, yes. They're not soldiers, they're investors. They want results, not control over methodology. Then we have a deal. They shook on it. A simple gesture that meant everything and nothing. An agreement between people who didn't trust each other but saw mutual benefit and cooperation. The foundation of every alliance that had ever existed. Vera and her associates left an hour later with promises to make contact in 2 weeks with supplies and intelligence. Lyra sat at the bar nursing a drink she wasn't actually consuming and tried to process what she'd just agreed to. Revolution. Armed resistance against the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. Leading people she'd never met into a fight that would probably kill most of them. All because she couldn't let go of the rage that had been building in her chest since the moment Draven looked at her like she was disposable. Mara slid onto the stool beside her. That was either the smartest thing you've ever done or the dumbest. Haven't decided yet. You know they're using you. I know! Lyra finally took a drink. But I'm using them too. That's how this works. Just don't forget who you're doing this for. The woman's voice was quiet. Revenge makes a shitty foundation for leadership. Good thing I'm not doing it for revenge. No? No. Lyra set down her glass. I'm doing it because 6 months ago a king told me I was worthless. Told an entire court I'd failed at the only job that mattered. And every day I survive out here, every day I get stronger instead of dying like I was supposed to, I prove him wrong. This just takes it further. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then she poured them both another drink. To proving bastards wrong. They drank. The supplies arrived 2 weeks later exactly as promised. Weapons, food, medicine, maps with detailed intelligence about patrol routes and garrison strengths. Everything Lyra needed to start building something that could actually challenge Empire control in the target territories. She started small. Recruited people from the borderlands who had reasons to hate Draven, which was most of them. Taught them what she'd learned about fighting dirty, about moving unseen, about hitting hard and disappearing before reinforcements arrived. Built a core group of 20 fighters who were competent enough to not get themselves killed immediately. The first raid was against a tax collection convoy. 3 guards, 2 bureaucrats, and enough coin to fund their operation for months. They hit it at dawn on a lonely stretch of road, overwhelmed the guards before they could shift, and vanished into the forest with the entire haul. Clean, professional. Exactly as planned. The second raid went the same way. Then the third. Small victories that barely registered in the Empire's vast machinery, but built confidence in her fighters and proved they could actually do this. Word spread. More recruits showed up. People who'd lost family to Draven's wars, who'd been taxed into poverty, who'd watched their territories stripped of resources to feed the capital's expansion. They came looking for someone who'd fight back, and Lyra gave them that. Gave them training and purpose, and the first real hope some of them had felt in years. 3 months in, they hit their first garrison, a small outpost that controlled a key river crossing, manned by a dozen soldiers who'd gotten comfortable in the routine of easy occupation. Lyra's force was 30 strong by then, well-armed and battle-tested enough to coordinate a real assault. They took the garrison in under an hour, killed 8 soldiers, captured 4, and sent them running back to the capital with a message carved into their flesh. The rejected queen remembers. That's when Draven noticed. The response was immediate and brutal. He sent 200 soldiers into the territory with orders to crush the rebellion and bring Lyra back alive. The local population got caught in the middle. Homes burned. People executed on suspicion of collaboration. The kind of indiscriminate violence that was supposed to make everyone so terrified they'd turn on the rebels just to make it stop. It had the opposite effect. For every person Draven's soldiers killed, 3 more joined Lyra's cause. For every home burned, a dozen fighters appeared ready to burn the Empire back. Fear worked when people had something left to lose. But Draven's crackdown destroyed so thoroughly that people had nothing left except rage and the desire to make him pay for it. Lyra's force grew to 100, then 200, then 500 fighters spread across 3 territories, coordinating attacks and sharing intelligence, and slowly choking the Empire's control over the region. Vera's coalition was thrilled, sent more supplies, more funding, more assurances that they were committed to seeing this through. Lyra barely noticed. She was too busy running a war, too focused on the next target, the next battle, the next step in building something that could actually threaten Draven's power. She was winning, actually winning, and the taste of it was intoxicating. That should have been the warning. The message came 6 months after she'd started the rebellion. A courier arrived in camp, exhausted and terrified, with a sealed letter addressed to Lyra personally. She opened it, expecting intelligence or new orders from Vera's coalition. Instead, she got 3 words that stopped her heart. It's a trap. No signature. No context. Just those 3 words in handwriting she didn't recognize on paper that looked expensive enough to come from noble stock. Lyra stared at it, mind racing through possibilities. A trap from who? The coalition? Draven? Some third player she hadn't accounted for? And why warn her? Who benefited from her knowing if it was real? And who benefited from paranoia if it wasn't? She called her inner circle together. 8 people she'd fought beside for months, who'd proven themselves in blood and fire. Cole from the Hunter's camp had found her 3 months in, along with a dozen others from Kara's group. They formed the core of her command structure. What do you think? She showed them the note. Cole's expression darkened. Think we need to find out who sent this and make them talk? Or it's legitimate and we need to reassess everything we're doing? That was Lyris, one of Vera's original associates who'd stayed on as a liaison. If someone's setting us up, we need to know who and why. They debated for hours. Theories flying, accusations barely restrained, the paranoia of people who'd learned the hard way that trust was a luxury that got you killed. Finally, Lyra made the call. We keep operating but change our patterns. No more predictable targets, no more coordinating through Vera's channels. We go dark for 2 weeks and see who panics. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody but prevented the group from tearing itself apart over suspicion. They went dark, stopped all communication with the coalition, moved camp 3 times in 10 days, ran silent and watched to see what happened. Nothing happened. No attempts to contact them. No increased patrols searching for their location. Just silence that stretched out and made everyone more paranoid instead of less. Maybe the note was bullshit. Maybe someone was trying to divide them from their backers. Maybe Lyra was being played by her own paranoia. She was still debating it when Vera showed up in person. The woman arrived at their current camp with a small escort, looking annoyed and concerned in equal measure. Why did you cut contact? We had supply shipments ready to move and couldn't reach you. Security concerns. Lyra kept her voice neutral. Had reason to believe our communications were compromised. By who? That's what I'm trying to figure out. She watched Vera's face carefully, looking for any tells, any sign that the woman knew more than she was saying. You have any enemies in your coalition who might want this to fail? Vera's laugh was sharp. Everyone in the coalition has enemies. That's how nobility works. But sabotaging this operation would hurt them as much as us. Draven weakened benefits everyone involved. Unless someone's playing a longer game. The woman's eyes narrowed. You think one of my people is working with Draven? I think someone warned me this is a trap, and I'm trying to figure out if they're right. They talked in circles for an hour. Vera insisting the coalition was solid, Lyra pointing out that political alliances were only as strong as the current mutual benefit. Neither convinced the other, but they agreed to resume coordination with additional security measures. Vera left. Lyra watched her go and couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. Some crucial piece of information that would make everything make sense. The attack came 3 days later. They hit the camp at midnight with a force 3 times the size of anything Draven had sent before. Coordinated, professional. Hitting from multiple angles at once with intelligence that could only have come from someone who knew exactly where the camp was and how it was defended. Lyra's people fought like demons, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The camp turned into chaos, fire and screaming and the wet sounds of steel finding flesh. She fought her way through it, trying to rally her fighters, trying to organize any kind of coherent defense. Cole went down first, took a blade to the gut protecting her flank and died choking on his own blood while she screamed his name. Then others. People she'd trained, fought beside, trusted, dropping around her while the Empire soldiers pushed forward with mechanical efficiency. This wasn't a raid, it was an execution. Lyra killed 3 soldiers and wounded 2 more before a blow to her head sent her sprawling. Vision swimming, ears ringing. Someone grabbed her arms, yanked them behind her back, zip-tied her wrists so tight the plastic cut into skin. The fighting stopped. Her people were dead or captured or fled into the woods. The camp was destroyed. Everything she'd built over 6 months gone in less than an hour. A figure walked through the smoke and firelight. Tall, commanding, moving with the kind of absolute confidence that came from knowing the game was already won. Draven. He looked exactly the same, perfect control, cold eyes, the bearing of a man who'd never doubted his own power. He stopped 5 feet away and stared down at her, kneeling in the dirt with blood running down her face. "Did you really think it would be this easy?" His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "That you could play revolutionary and I wouldn't notice? How did you find us?" "I didn't have to find you." Draven crouched down to eye level. "I've known where you were since the first raid. Every supply shipment, every new recruit, every target you hit, I knew all of it." The words hit like physical blows. Impossible. They'd been careful, changed locations, vetted everyone who joined. Then Draven smiled and everything came apart. "Your noble coalition was mine from the beginning, every one of them, playing their parts perfectly while feeding me every detail of your little rebellion." Lyra's mind raced backward, reassembling 6 months of memories with this new context. Vera's convenient arrival in the borderlands, the perfectly timed supplies, the intelligence that was always just accurate enough, the targets that seemed important but never actually threatened anything Draven cared about. It had all been theater. A stage managed to give her hope, to let her build something real enough to hurt when it was destroyed. "Why?" The word came out broken. "Why go through all of this?" "Because you needed to learn." Draven's expression didn't change. "You rejected me in front of my court, humiliated me, made me look weak. I could have killed you immediately, but that would have made you a martyr. Could have let you die in exile, but that would have left the question of what if. This way, I let you try. Let you build your pathetic rebellion and believe you had a chance. Let you recruit people and make promises you couldn't keep." He stood, looking down at her with something that might have been pity in someone capable of that emotion. "And now when you fail, when all these people die because they believed in you, you'll know it was all pointless from the start. You were never a threat, never had a chance. You were just entertainment while I consolidated control over territories I couldn't take openly without political backlash. Your rebellion gave me the excuse to march armies through and crush resistance that's been festering for years. You did more for my empire than any of my loyal nobles." The cruelty of it was breathtaking, not just defeating her, but making her the instrument of her own destruction, making her complicit in the deaths of everyone who'd trusted her, making her rebellion the tool that let him tighten his grip instead of loosen it. Lyra felt something inside her crack, not her will, not her defiance, something deeper, the part of her that still believed the world had rules, that truth mattered, that fighting back meant something even if you lost. All of it lies. All of it manipulation. All of it designed to break her more thoroughly than any physical torture could. The Tide Queen kneeling in the dirt wasn't the girl who'd walked out of his palace 6 months ago. That girl had died somewhere between the first kill and the 100th decision that cost lives. This version was harder, colder, carved down to essentials by survival and war. But even this version had limits, lines she wouldn't cross, things she believed in despite everything. Draven had just shown her those beliefs were weapons he could use against her. Take her to the capital. His order was casual, dismissive. Public trial, public execution. Make sure everyone sees what happens to people who challenge my rule, and the survivors of her little army make examples, slow ones. He walked away without looking back, and Lyra knelt there in the ruins of everything she'd tried to build, surrounded by bodies of people who died believing in her. The soldiers hauled her to her feet, started dragging her toward the transport cages they'd brought for prisoners. She didn't fight. What was the point? She'd already lost. lost so completely she hadn't even known she was playing a rigged game until it was over. Behind her, the camp burned, smoke rising into the night sky like a funeral pyre for hope itself. They threw her in a cage barely big enough to crouch in, locked it, and loaded it onto a wagon. Other cages held survivors of her force, people who'd trusted her, who'd followed her into rebellion thinking she knew what she was doing. She couldn't look at them. The journey to the capital took 5 days. 5 days in a cage that didn't let her stand or stretch. 5 days of minimal food and water. 5 days of listening to the other prisoners cry or rage or fall silent with despair. 5 days to understand exactly how thoroughly she'd been used. This is what power looks like when you don't have it. Not the ability to choose your own path, but the illusion of choice while someone else writes the story. Not freedom, but a longer leash that lets you run far enough to believe you escape before it yanks you back. Lyra had thought she was building something real. Thought her defiance mattered. Thought she'd found a way to fight back against a system that had discarded her. But she'd just been a pawn in a game played by people who understood power better than she ever would. And the worst part was knowing that if Vera or one of the coalition had warned her, if someone had told her the truth, she probably wouldn't have believed them. She'd wanted the rebellion too badly, needed it too much, needed to believe she could matter. That need had killed everyone who trusted her. They reached the capital at sunset, the same city she'd left 6 months ago as an exile. Now she was returning as a prisoner, paraded through streets so everyone could see the fate of rebels. People lined the roads, some jeering, some silent, some looking away like they couldn't bear to watch. Lyra kept her head up anyway, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken, even though she was shattered inside. They took her to the dungeon beneath the palace. Real dungeon, not the pretty cells they used for noble prisoners. Stone and iron and the smell of old blood and human waste. They threw her in alone, finally cutting the zip ties that had left her wrists raw and swollen. She collapsed on the stone floor and for the first time in 6 months, let herself cry. Not pretty tears, ugly, choking sobs that shook her entire body and brought up sounds she didn't know she could make. Grief and rage and shame mixing together until she couldn't tell them apart. She'd failed. Not just herself, but everyone who'd believed in her. Cole was dead. Dozens of others were dead. The territories she'd tried to liberate were now under even harsher control, and it was all her fault for being too stupid, too angry, too desperate to see she was being manipulated. Draven had won. Not just the battle, but the war. Not just her body, but her mind. He'd proven she was nothing without his permission. Proven she couldn't build anything he couldn't destroy. Proven that her defiance in the throne room had been temporary insanity, not genuine strength. He'd broken her. But here's the thing about breaking. You can break glass and it's done. Shattered. Useless. But you can break a bone and if it heals right, it heals stronger than before. Harder. More capable of bearing weight. Lyra lay on that stone floor and felt herself breaking, felt every assumption she'd made about herself and the world crack apart. Felt the girl who'd believed in fairy tales die finally and completely. Felt the woman who'd thought she could lead a rebellion crumble into dust. And underneath all that breaking, underneath all that death and destruction and failure, something else stirred. Something that had been sleeping in her blood since the night she drank from that stream in the forest. Something old and patient that had been waiting for her to be stripped down to nothing so it could finally wake up. Her eyes snapped open and they were glowing silver in the darkness of her cell. The pain hit immediately. Not external. Internal. Like her bones were reshaping themselves from the inside out. Like her DNA was rewriting itself in real time. She screamed and couldn't stop, curling into a ball while her body tried to tear itself apart and rebuild simultaneously. This was it. The thing she'd always had but never accessed. The power that came from bloodlines older than empires. From magic that predated shifters and civilization and all the pretty rules Draven's kingdom was built on. Her true nature finally forcing its way to the surface because she had nothing left to lose and nowhere left to hide. The transformation lasted hours. When it finally stopped, when the pain finally receded to something bearable, Lyra uncurled slowly and looked at her hands in the dim light coming through the cell door. They looked the same, but they felt different. Stronger. Like they could tear through iron bars if she wanted. Like they'd never been truly hers until this moment. She stood. The cell felt smaller. Or she felt bigger. Hard to tell which. The trial was scheduled for tomorrow. Public execution to follow. Draven's final demonstration of what happened to people who challenged him. But the woman who would stand in that court wasn't the same one he'd caged. She was something else entirely. And when she finally showed him what she'd become, what his cruelty had forced into existence, he was going to regret every choice that led to this moment. The game had changed again. And this time, she was writing the rules. The trial was set for dawn. The entire court would assemble to watch justice delivered in the form of a public execution. Draven had orchestrated it perfectly, timing the spectacle for maximum visibility, ensuring every noble and commoner alike understood the consequences of defiance. But dawn was still hours away, and in those hours, everything would change. Lyra sat in her cell and felt the power moving under her skin like liquid lightning. It wasn't comfortable, wasn't gentle. It felt like holding a wildfire in her chest and trying not to let it burn through her ribs. Every breath pulled in energy from somewhere deep, somewhere old, somewhere that didn't play by the rules shifters had built their entire civilization around. This was what her bloodline had been hiding, what generations had suppressed because it was too dangerous, too uncontrollable, too fundamentally opposed to the pack hierarchy that kept shifter society from tearing itself apart. The kind of power that didn't bow to alphas, or accept chains, or fit into neat little boxes labeled acceptable and manageable. The kind of power that got people killed for having it. Her cell door was solid iron, 3 inches thick, designed to hold the strongest shifters if they went feral or tried to escape. She stood and walked to it, placed both hands flat against the cold metal and pushed, not with her muscles, with the thing inside her that had finally woken up. The door didn't just bend. It exploded outward, torn from its hinges and frame like it was made of paper instead of forged steel. The sound echoed through the dungeon, a crash that would bring guards running in seconds. Good. She was done hiding. The first guard rounded the corner at a sprint, sword drawn, eyes wide with shock at seeing her standing free in the corridor. He opened his mouth to shout an alarm, and she was on him before sound could form. Moved faster than thought, faster than any normal shifter could track. Her hand closed around his throat and lifted him off his feet like he weighed nothing. She could feel his pulse hammering against her palm, could smell his fear, sharp and acrid, could kill him with a thought, with the smallest application of pressure. But that wasn't who she was. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She threw him into the wall hard enough to knock him unconscious, but not hard enough to shatter his skull. He crumpled and stayed down. She took his keys and his blade and kept moving. The dungeon was a maze of corridors and cells, most of them empty, some holding prisoners who'd been forgotten or were waiting for judgments that might never come. She found the section holding her people in less than a minute. The survivors of her rebellion, caged and broken and waiting for whatever torture Draven had planned. Their eyes widened when they saw her, not walking toward them but flowing, moving with a grace and speed that shouldn't have been possible. And her eyes were still glowing silver, lighting the dim corridor like twin flames. "What are you?" One of them whispered it like a prayer or a curse, couldn't tell which. Doesn't matter. Lyra worked the keys quickly, opening cells one after another. What matters is we're leaving, now. There were maybe 20 of them left. All injured, all traumatized, all looking at her like she was either salvation or something worse than Draven. She couldn't blame them. She didn't know what she was either. Just knew that the thing moving under her skin demanded action, demanded she stop accepting circumstances and start creating them. "Can you fight?" They stared. Some nodded. Some just looked empty, hollowed out by the realization that everything they'd fought for had been orchestrated from the beginning. Then fight. We go up, we go through anyone who tries to stop us, and we burn this palace to bedrock before we leave. It was suicide. All of them knew it. 20 injured rebels against hundreds of trained soldiers in the heart of enemy territory, with no backup and no escape plan. The kind of move that got people killed in spectacular fashion and accomplished nothing except making the history books slightly more interesting. But here's what happens when you've lost everything. When the worst has already happened and you're standing in the ruins of hope itself. You stop calculating odds, stop weighing consequences, stop asking permission from reality to do the impossible. You just move. They armed themselves from fallen guards and started up. Each level of the dungeon had defenders, but they were used to prisoners who were beaten, broken, compliant. They weren't ready for Lyra moving like violence given form, for the silver light in her eyes that seemed to burn through their confidence and leave only fear. She cut through them, not elegant, not clean, just brutal efficiency backed by power that shouldn't exist. Her blade found throats and hearts, while her free hand broke bones and shattered skulls. Behind her, her people followed, fighting with the desperate ferocity of those who knew they were already dead and just hadn't fallen yet. The palace above was waking up, alarms screaming, soldiers mobilizing, the machinery of response kicking into gear to deal with an escape that should have been impossible. But they were already through the lower levels, already spilling into the main palace corridors where stone gave way to marble and the ceiling soared high enough to make you feel small. Where she'd walked for 3 years pretending to be something acceptable, something that fit. No more pretending. They fought their way toward the throne room, not because it was strategic, because it was symbolic. Because everything had started there 6 months ago when she dropped her crown and walked away, and it needed to end there for the story to be complete. Soldiers poured in from every corridor, more than Lyra's group could handle even with her leading them. They were being boxed in, surrounded, forced into a defensive position in a grand hall lined with portraits of dead kings. This is where we make our stand. She turned to face her people, this ragged group of believers who'd trusted her and been betrayed and still chosen to follow her out of hell. If anyone wants to run, now's the time. I won't think less of you. None of them moved. Then we hold until the king comes. Make him face what he created. Because that's what leadership is when you strip away the politics and the strategy and all the careful manipulation. It's standing between your people and death. It's choosing to break instead of bend. It's being so absolutely certain of your path that others will follow you into the fire because at least it's honest burning instead of slow suffocation. The soldiers attacked, wave after wave of trained fighters throwing themselves against 20 rebels who shouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. But they held. Lyra in the center, burning silver and moving too fast to track, while her people guarded her flanks and fought like demons because they had nothing left to lose. Bodies fell. Theirs and the soldiers. Blood slicked the marble. The hall filled with the sounds of steel and screaming and the wet impacts of flesh being destroyed. This wasn't battle, it was slaughter. And Lyra was at the center of it, feeling the power inside her grow stronger with every moment, feeding on the violence and the chaos and her own absolute refusal to stop. Then the soldiers pulled back, all at once, creating space between themselves and the rebels who'd somehow survived the initial assault. And Draven walked into the hall. He moved like gravity itself had decided to take physical form, every step deliberate, every motion carrying the weight of absolute authority. He was still in his formal clothes, no armor, no weapons visible, just a king walking into a room full of corpses and acting like it was exactly where he belonged. His eyes found Lyra immediately. She was painted in blood, some of it hers, but most of it not, standing over fallen soldiers with silver light still burning in her gaze. They stared at each other across 50 feet of carnage, and the air between them felt heavy enough to crush bone. "You should have stayed in your cage." His voice was quiet, but it carried through the hall like he was speaking directly into everyone's skull. Would have been faster, less painful. Faster for who? For everyone. He gestured at the bodies scattered across the marble. These soldiers had families, children. You've accomplished nothing except adding more corpses to your count. The cruelty of it. Blaming her for deaths he'd caused by creating the conditions that forced this confrontation. Making her carry the weight of consequences while he stood clean and righteous in the ruins of his own design. But Lyra had learned something in that cell. Something fundamental about power and truth and the difference between them. Power could make you king, could let you control armies and territories and write laws that others had to follow. But truth was harder. Truth was what remained when all the power structures collapsed. And the truth was simple. You did this. Not me. You created every circumstance that led to this moment. She took a step forward. You threw me away and then manipulated my rebellion to consolidate power. You used my hope as a weapon. You killed everyone who trusted me because it served your purposes. So don't stand there and blame me for defending myself when you've been trying to destroy me since the moment I wasn't useful anymore. The court was assembling now. Nobles appearing in doorways and balconies, drawn by the noise and the blood and the spectacle of their king facing down a rebel in his own palace. They watched in silence, probably calculating how this would affect their own positions, their own carefully maintained alliances. Political creatures always calculating, never acting. Draven's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Not quite surprise. More like recognition. Like he was seeing her clearly for the first time since she'd walked out of this palace 6 months ago. You've changed. Had to. The old version was too easy to break. She shifted. Not a full transformation, but a partial one, letting her true nature bleed through without completely abandoning human form. Her hands elongated into claws tipped with silver light. Her features sharpened, became more predatory, and the power radiating from her made the air shimmer like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. The court gasped. Nobles who'd seen 1,000 shifter transformations were staring at her like she was breaking the laws of nature just by existing, because they could feel it, the wrongness, the otherness, the sense that she'd tapped into something older and more dangerous than the carefully controlled power they'd built their society around. What are you? Draven's voice held genuine curiosity now. That's not shifter magic. No. It's older, deeper. The kind of thing your empire was built to suppress because it doesn't fit in your hierarchy. It doesn't bow to alphas or accept its place in the pack order. She smiled, and it was all teeth. It's the thing you should have been afraid of instead of trying to control. Then he moved. Faster than she expected. Faster than should have been possible for someone who wasn't channeling ancient power. He closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, hand wrapping around her throat exactly like he'd done in the throne room 6 months ago. But this time when he squeezed, she didn't just endure it. She grabbed his wrist and tore his hand away. Felt his bones creak under her grip. Saw his eyes widen slightly as he realized she wasn't just strong. She was stronger. Things have changed. She drove her knee into his ribs hard enough to crack them. Heard his breath explode out. Felt the impact travel up her leg like hitting stone. I'm not that girl anymore. He recovered faster than she could press the advantage. Twisted out of her grip and came back with a strike aimed at her throat. She blocked it, barely, the force of his blow sending shockwaves up her arm. They separated, circling each other in the center of the blood-soaked hall while the court watched in stunned silence. This was unprecedented. A king fighting seriously against someone who wasn't another alpha, wasn't another legitimate threat to his throne. Fighting against a rejected queen who by all rights should have died in exile and become a footnote in history. But here she was, matching him blow for blow, making him actually try instead of just overwhelming her through pure dominance. You can't win. Draven's voice was steady despite the pain she could see in his movements. Even if you kill me, the Empire will crush you. My generals will hunt you. My nobles will turn whatever you try to build into ash. You're one person against a system that's been perfected over generations. Good thing I'm not trying to win then. She lunged, not at him but past him, toward the throne sitting at the far end of the hall. He caught her halfway, but she'd expected that, used his momentum against him, twisted and threw him into a marble column hard enough to crack it. Kept moving while he recovered, closing the distance to that obsidian throne that represented everything wrong with his empire. The throne where he'd rejected her, where he'd tried to erase her, where every decision that led to this moment had been made. She grabbed the armrests and lifted. The throne was massive, carved from a single piece of stone, probably weighed more than a car. She lifted it anyway, lifted it over her head while power flowed through her like lightning through copper wire. And then she threw it. Not at Draven. At the massive stained glass window behind it. The one depicting his coronation, showing him crowned and righteous and absolutely perfect. The throne smashed through the window in an explosion of glass and stone, kept going, tumbling through the air, falling 3 stories to the courtyard below, where it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The court stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the throne had been, at the broken window letting in cold morning air, at the impossible image of their king's symbol of authority destroyed by a woman they'd all dismissed as worthless 6 months ago. Lyra turned to face Draven. He was on his feet, blood running from a cut above his eye, breathing harder than she'd ever seen. Looking at her with an expression that was equal parts rage and something else she couldn't quite name. I told you, I'm not trying to win. I'm trying to show everyone that you're not inevitable, that your power is just an agreement we all made to pretend you're untouchable. Break the agreement and you're just a man who bleeds like anyone else. Then prove it. He shifted fully. Not partial transformation, but complete wolf form, massive and black as midnight, with eyes that burned red with alpha dominance. Come on then, rejected queen. Let's see what you really are. Here's the truth about fighting an alpha king. You can be stronger, can be faster, can have power he doesn't understand. But he's been fighting his entire life, been training since birth to dominate anything that challenges him, has centuries of pack knowledge and technique bred into his bones. You're just one person who learned to survive. They clashed in the center of the hall, wolf and something else, something that didn't have a name because it had been suppressed so long nobody remembered what to call it. Claws and teeth and impacts that shook the floor. She was holding her own, but barely, instinct and desperation keeping her alive more than any real skill. He was better at this. Simple as that. Had the experience she lacked, the training she'd never received. And he was using it ruthlessly, exploiting every opening, every moment she left herself exposed. She took a slash across her ribs that went deep, felt blood pour down her side, took another across her shoulder that made her left arm go numb. He was cutting her apart piece by piece, proving his point with every strike. That she was outmatched, out of her depth, playing at revolution while he'd been born to rule. But she'd learned something these 6 months, something fundamental about survival that no amount of training could teach. You don't win by being better. You win by refusing to stop, by taking every hit and standing back up, by making them work for every inch until they realize killing you costs more than letting you live. She stopped trying to fight clean, started fighting dirty, went for eyes and throat and joints, places where technique didn't matter as much as pure vicious intent. Used her smaller size to get inside his guard. Used the environment, throwing him into walls and columns, bringing down chandeliers that crashed around them in showers of crystal. The hall was coming apart. So were they. Both bleeding from dozens of wounds. Both running on fumes and willpower. Both knowing this ended when one of them stopped moving. Her people were still fighting at the hall's entrance. Still holding back soldiers who wanted to rush in and turn this into an execution instead of a duel. They were buying her time with their lives, falling one by one, while she threw everything she had at a king who'd spent his entire life learning how not to fall. Draven caught her by the throat again, slammed her into the floor so hard the marble cracked, leaned down with jaws open, going for the killing bite that would end this. And Lyra did the only thing left to do. She stopped fighting him and started fighting herself. Let go of the control, let go of the fear, let go of everything human and reasonable and safe. Let the power that had been burning in her chest since that night by the waterfall explode outward without restraint. The light that erupted from her was silver and blinding. Not metaphor, actual light that filled the hall and made everyone watching cry out and cover their eyes. It burned through Draven's grip, forced him back, sent him skidding across blood-slicked marble. And when it faded, what stood where Lyra had been wasn't quite wolf, and wasn't quite human, and wasn't quite anything the Empire had seen in generations. It was something older, something wild, something that made the Alpha King take an involuntary step backward. The court was silent. Even the fighting at the entrance had stopped, everyone staring at this impossible thing standing in the center of their perfect marble hall. Lyra felt it moving through her. Not power she wielded, but power she'd become. The difference between holding a sword and being the blade. And it felt like coming home to a place she'd never known existed. She looked at Draven with eyes that burned silver fire. When she spoke, her voice came out layered, like multiple people speaking in unison, like reality itself was bending to let her words through. You were right about one thing. I can't destroy your empire, can't kill all your generals or convince your nobles or force everyone to follow me, but I can do something worse. I can show them there's an alternative, can build something in the ruins where all your rejected people go, can create a place where your power doesn't reach and your rules don't apply. And every person who chooses that over your perfect control is a crack in your foundation. She shifted back to human form, or close enough, still glowing slightly, still radiating that sense of otherness that made pack instincts scream in confusion. So I'm leaving, taking everyone who wants to come. And you're going to let me, because if you don't, I'll bring this entire palace down on both our heads, and we'll see who survives the rubble. It was a bluff. Mostly. She didn't actually know if she could bring down the palace. Wasn't sure she'd survive trying. But Draven didn't know that. And in the moment, with blood in his eyes and his throne shattered and his court watching him get challenged by someone who should have been dead, He had to make a choice: fight and risk losing in front of everyone, or let her go and maintain the illusion of control. She saw the calculation in his eyes, saw him weigh options, saw the exact moment he decided which mattered more. "Get out." His voice was cold. "Take your rebels and leave my territory. If I see you again, if you ever set foot in my empire again, I'll kill everyone you've ever spoken to and make you watch before I let you die. Understood?" She turned her back on him, the ultimate gesture of disrespect, walked toward her people who were staring at her like she'd grown a second head, gestured for them to follow. They did. Slowly, looking back at the king like expecting him to change his mind and order their execution anyway. But he didn't move, just stood there in his ruined hall, covered in blood, watching them leave. And Lyra knew what it cost him, knew that letting her walk away was worse than killing her would have been, because it proved she was right. His power was just an agreement, and she'd just broken it. They made it to the palace entrance before the voice stopped them. Wait, Draven was following, not pursuing. Just following at a distance that wasn't quite threatening. He stopped 30 feet away, and for the first time since she'd known him, his expression showed something other than perfect control. What you did, what you are. His jaw worked. I didn't think that was possible anymore. Lots of things are possible when you stop trying to control them. Silence stretched between them. The entire palace was watching from windows and doorways, history being made in real time. Then Draven spoke again, and his voice held something she'd never heard from him before. Regret. I should have seen you, really seen you, not what I needed you to be, but what you actually were. Maybe this all could have been different. Lyra felt something twist in her chest. Not forgiveness, not even close, but maybe understanding that they'd both been trapped in roles neither of them chose, both playing parts in a story written by people long dead, both destroying each other because the system they lived in demanded it. Maybe it could have been different. She met his eyes. But it wasn't, and we both have to live with that. She turned away again, led her people out of the palace, through streets filled with stunned citizens, through gates that opened for them because nobody knew what else to do, out of the capital and toward the borderlands and whatever came next. Behind her, Draven stood in the entrance of his palace and watched her go. Watched the woman he'd tried to destroy walk away on her own terms. And for the first time in his perfectly controlled life, he didn't know what to do about it. In the throne room, nobles were already gathering, already calculating, already whispering about what this meant for the stability of the empire. Whether the king who'd let a rebel walk was still strong enough to maintain control. Whether this was the beginning of something bigger. And far to the south, in places the empire had never fully conquered, people heard stories of a glowing queen who'd faced down the Alpha King and walked away alive. Stories that spread like wildfire through populations that had been waiting for exactly this kind of symbol, this kind of hope. Lyra and her people traveled for days, heading south toward territories where empire control was more suggestion than law, toward places where people who didn't fit could build something new. They stopped at a clearing on the third day, a place where 3 rivers met, where the land was rich and unclaimed, where they could see approaching threats from every direction. This is where we start. Lyra looked at the 20 people who'd survived everything, who'd followed her through hell and back. We build here, not an empire, not a kingdom, just a place where people can exist without bowing to anyone's power but their own. They set to work, building shelters, marking territory, starting the slow process of creating something from nothing. And as the sun set on their first day in what would become their new home, Lyra stood on a hill overlooking the camp and felt the power moving under her skin. Still there, still waiting, still ready for whatever came next. Because this wasn't over. Wouldn't be over until one of them was dead, or the empire was broken, or some third option nobody had thought of yet emerged from the chaos. But for now, in this moment, she'd done something nobody else had managed. She'd challenged the system and survived, had shown that resistance was possible, that the emperor had no clothes if you just stopped pretending he did. She looked north toward the capital she'd escaped, toward the king who'd let her go, and smiled. Round 1 was over. Round 2 was about to begin, and this time she wasn't fighting for revenge or pride or even justice. She was fighting to rewrite the rules of what power meant. In the capital, Draven stood at his window and felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Fear. Not of Lyra specifically, of what she represented, of the cracks she'd put in foundations he'd thought were unshakable, of the questions she'd planted in every mind that witnessed their confrontation. What if the king isn't untouchable? And once that question took root, once people started really asking it, everything else was just a matter of time. He turned from the window and looked at his reconstructed throne, already rebuilt, already perfect, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and pretending otherwise wouldn't make it disappear. The game had changed, the pieces were in motion, and for the first time since he'd claimed his crown, Draven wasn't certain how this story ended. 3 months passed. Lyra's settlement grew from 20 survivors to 200 people who'd heard stories and came looking for the place where Empire rules didn't reach. They built proper structures, established governance that didn't rely on alpha dominance, but on consensus and shared responsibility. Created something that looked less like a pack and more like what humans had before shifters decided hierarchy was destiny. It was messy, chaotic. People argued constantly about how things should work, but it was theirs, built on choices instead of obedience, on participation instead of submission, and every day it existed was a challenge to everything Draven's empire stood for. News traveled. Stories of the rejected queen who'd built a refuge for misfits spread through territories where discontent had been simmering for years. People started asking questions, started wondering why they accepted systems that ground them down when alternatives existed just beyond the borders. Draven felt it, the shift in his empire's foundation. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a slow erosion of certainty. His nobles were restless, his generals cautious, his people less eager to die for expansion when they'd seen that defiance could survive. He'd maintained control through absolute certainty, through the appearance that his rule was natural law rather than enforced agreement. But Lyra had cracked that appearance, had shown that emperors wore clothes only because everyone agreed to see them that way. And now he was learning what happened when people started squinting. The war began not with declaration but with inevitability. Border conflicts, raids that might have been bandits or might have been Lyra's people testing defenses, refugees fleeing the empire toward her settlement, draining population from territories that depended on labor to function. Small provocations that added up, death by 1,000 cuts, while both sides prepared for the confrontation they knew was coming. Because here's what happens when you build something that directly challenges existing power. You can claim you just want to be left alone, can insist you're not threatening anyone, but your existence is the threat. Every person who chooses your way over theirs is a piece of legitimacy stripped away. Every day you survive proves their system isn't inevitable. They have to destroy you or admit you were right. There's no middle ground. The attack came 6 months after she'd walked out of Draven's palace. A full military assault with 500 soldiers, siege equipment, and the clear intention to erase her settlement from existence. Not to conquer, not to absorb, to eliminate so thoroughly that people would forget it ever existed. Lyra stood on the wall they'd built and watched the army approach. Her people were ready as civilians could be against professional soldiers. They'd trained, prepared, built defenses and established fallback positions, but they were outnumbered 3-1 by fighters who'd spent their lives learning how to kill efficiently. She could run, take her people and scatter into the wilderness, live to fight another day from the shadows. It was the smart move, the strategic choice. But strategy required accepting that some battles couldn't be won, and she was done accepting limits imposed by other people's expectations. Here's what leadership means when everything's on the line. Not speeches or inspiration or clever tactics, just the willingness to stand between your people and destruction even when standing means dying. The absolute certainty that some things are worth bleeding for even if the blood doesn't change anything. Lyra had spent 6 months building this place, had watched broken people find purpose again, had seen what happened when you gave people agency instead of orders, and she'd be damned if she let it get erased because a king couldn't tolerate alternatives to his perfect control. They held the walls for 3 hours, held them through waves of attackers who came with professional efficiency and the confidence of superior numbers. Lyra fought on the front line, not because she was the best warrior, but because her people needed to see her bleeding with them. Needed to know she wasn't asking them to sacrifice anything she wasn't willing to sacrifice first. The silver light came easier now. She'd learned to control it, to channel it without losing herself completely. Became a beacon on the wall, burning bright enough that attacking soldiers had to look away or go blind. Buying seconds that let her people reposition, regroup, survive a little longer. But survival wasn't victory. They were losing. Slowly but inevitably, the walls were cracking. Her people were falling, and the Empire soldiers kept coming with the mechanical patience of those who knew time was on their side. Then the horn sounded from the north. Not Empire horns. Different, higher pitched, followed by the sight of hundreds of fighters pouring over the hills, attacking the Empire's flank with coordination that spoke of planning rather than spontaneous assistance. Lyra recognized the banner. Kara's. The hunters from the camp who'd helped her months ago. But they weren't alone. Other banners she didn't recognize, other groups of exiles and refugees and people who'd heard what was happening and decided they weren't going to watch another rebellion get crushed. The battle turned. Not easily, not cleanly, but the Empire forces found themselves caught between defenders who wouldn't break and reinforcements who fought with nothing to lose. Found themselves taking casualties they hadn't planned for, losing the momentum that came from overwhelming superiority. And in the chaos, Draven appeared. He rode through his own soldiers, dispersing them with gestures, creating space in the center of the battlefield. Creating an arena. When he dismounted and shifted to his massive wolf form, the message was clear. This ends between us. Lyra jumped from the wall, landed hard but stayed on her feet, walked toward him through carnage and mud and blood, feeling her people and his watching from their respective lines, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressing down like atmosphere itself had gotten heavier. They stood 20 feet apart, king and rebel, former mates who'd destroyed each other trying to fit into roles that were never meant for either of them. She shifted partially. Not full transformation, but enough to meet him as something closer to equal. Silver light crawled across her skin like living lightning. Her eyes burned with power that made pack instincts scream because it refused to fit in their hierarchy. "Why are you here?" Her voice carried across the sudden silence. "You sent your army. Could have stayed in your palace and waited for reports. Why come yourself?" Draven's massive wolf form shifted slightly. When he spoke, the words came rough but clear. "Because you deserve to know why you're dying. And why is that? Because you're right." His answer hit like a physical blow. "Everything you said about my empire, about how I built it on fear and control, about how I treat people like chess pieces. You were right. And I can't let that truth exist. Here's what power costs when you strip away all the justifications. All the pretty speeches about duty and responsibility and the burden of leadership. What it costs is the ability to admit you're wrong, to change, to be anything other than what you've always been, because changing means admitting the foundation was flawed from the start." Draven had built his entire identity on being the perfect alpha king, on never doubting, never hesitating, never showing weakness that others could exploit. And now he stood across from living proof that his system was broken, that his certainty was manufactured, that everything he'd sacrificed to maintain control had been in service of something fundamentally unjust. He could admit that and try to change, spend the rest of his life rebuilding from different principles. Or he could eliminate the evidence and keep pretending his way was the only way. He'd chosen elimination, because changing would mean acknowledging that every person he'd crushed, every territory he'd conquered, every decision he'd made had been wrong. And that weight was heavier than any king could carry. So he'd rather kill her and maintain the lie than face the truth and try to do better. That's the tragedy of power. Not that it corrupts, that it makes truth unbearable. They fought in the center of two armies, fought with everything they had, neither holding back, both knowing this was the end regardless of who won. Their clash was brutal, savage. Two beings that didn't quite fit natural law tearing at each other, while soldiers from both sides watched in stunned silence. Draven was still better, still faster, still had centuries of pack knowledge working through muscle memory. He landed blow after blow, opening wounds across her ribs and shoulders and legs, proving with every strike that she was outmatched. But she kept standing, kept fighting, kept coming at him with the relentless refusal to quit that had kept her alive through everything he'd thrown at her. And slowly, impossibly, he started to slow. Started to falter. Not from injury, but from something deeper. From the realization that he couldn't break her, couldn't make her stop, couldn't prove through violence that his way was superior when she just kept standing back up. His certainty was cracking. She could see it in his movements, the hesitation that came from doubt, the moment of questioning before each strike that gave her opening she shouldn't have had. She caught his throat, slammed him into the ground hard enough to crater the earth, stood over him with claws raised for the killing blow while both armies held their breath. This is where it ends. She could barely speak through exhaustion and blood loss. This is where I prove you were wrong about everything. Then do it. His voice was rough, tired. Kill me and build your perfect alternative on my corpse. Show everyone that your way is better, because you won. That's what you think this is about? Winning, isn't it? What else matters? And there it was. The fundamental difference between them. He thought power was about domination, about winning every confrontation and crushing every challenge, about being the last one standing. She'd learned something different, that power was about choices, about creating space for people to be more than their assigned roles, about building systems that didn't require crushing others to function. Killing him would prove his worldview, would show that might makes right, and the strongest deserves to rule, would turn her into exactly what he was. So she did the hardest thing she'd ever done, harder than walking out of the palace, harder than surviving exile, harder than building a rebellion. She lowered her claws and stepped back. I'm not killing you. Not because you deserve mercy. Because killing you would validate everything you believe about power. Would prove that this is just about who's stronger. She shifted back to human form. Stood over him bleeding and exhausted and barely able to stand. But standing. Your empire is broken. Not because I destroyed it, because it was always broken. Built on the idea that some people deserve power and others deserve obedience. That strength means domination instead of protection. That control is more important than consent. She gestured at the armies watching. Look at them. Your soldiers and my people. They're not that different. They all just want to live without being crushed. Want to matter. Want to choose their own path. She turned to address both armies. Her voice carried across the battlefield, magnified by the power still crackling under her skin. This ends now. Not with his death or mine. With a choice. Anyone who wants to keep living under Empire rules, go with him. Anyone who wants to try something different, stay with me. No judgment either way. No punishment for choosing wrong. Just the freedom to decide for yourself. Silence. The kind that feels like the world holding its breath. Then movement. Soldiers from Draven's army stepping forward. Not all of them. Maybe a quarter. But enough. Enough to show that her words had reached through conditioning and hierarchy to touch something deeper. They crossed the space between armies and joined her people. Took off their colors and laid down their weapons, and stood waiting to see what happened next. Draven rose slowly, shifted back to human form, looked at the soldiers who'd abandoned him, and something in his expression finally broke. Not anger, not rage, just exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness that comes from carrying weight too long and realizing you can't hold it anymore. You've already won. His voice was hollow. Even if you let me leave, even if I rebuild, you've shown them there's an alternative. That's all it takes. The question in their minds that maybe I'm not inevitable. She met his eyes, saw past the king to the man underneath, the one who'd been shaped by systems as much as he'd shaped them, who'd been given power too young and taught that certainty was strength, who'd never learned how to admit mistakes because mistakes meant weakness and weakness meant death. She'd hated him for months, hated what he'd done to her and to everyone crushed under his empire. But looking at him now, broken and honest for maybe the first time in his life, she felt something closer to pity. Go home. Rebuild if you want. But know that every day your empire gets smaller. Every day more people will choose freedom over security. And eventually you'll rule over nothing but the people too afraid to leave. That's not ruling. That's dying slowly. Maybe. But it's the only path left. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she never expected. He knelt. Not submission, just acknowledgement, recognition of what she'd become and what it meant. I was wrong about you. His voice was quiet. You were never weak. I was just too certain of my own strength to see yours. Then he stood, called his remaining soldiers, and left. Walked away from a battle he could still have won through violence, but had lost through every other measure that mattered. Lyra watched him go and felt something in her chest finally release. Some knot of anger and hurt and rage that had been driving her since that day in the throne room. It didn't disappear completely. That kind of damage didn't heal in moments, but it loosened, became something she could carry instead of something that carried her. Her people surrounded her, questions pouring out. What happens now? Do we chase them? How do we handle the new refugees? 1,000 practical concerns that came with survival. She addressed them all, slowly, patiently, building consensus instead of issuing orders, letting people contribute instead of just following. It took hours, was exhausting in ways that fighting had never been. But it was honest, real, the kind of work that actually built something instead of just maintaining control. 3 days later, messengers started arriving from other territories, places where Draven's governors had been overthrown, where people had heard what happened and decided to try their own rebellions. Not all of them succeeded, some got crushed brutally, but enough succeeded that the map started changing. Empire control fracturing into pockets while alternative settlements sprouted in the spaces between. Lyra didn't try to rule them, didn't establish herself as some new empress replacing the old. Just offered guidance when asked, shared resources when possible. Let each place figure out what worked for them instead of imposing a single vision. It was slower, messier, but it was real change instead of just swapping one tyrant for another. 6 months after the battle, she stood on the same wall where she'd fought and looked out at a settlement that had tripled in size. People building lives, raising children, creating art and music, and all the things that happened when survival wasn't the only concern anymore. Mara found her there. The tavern keeper had arrived a month ago with a group from the borderlands, had immediately started organizing supply chains and logistics because apparently running a tavern prepared you for running infrastructure. You ever think about what comes after? Mara leaned against the wall beside her. After the excitement dies down and this is just normal life? All the time. Lyra smiled slightly. That's the goal. Make this boring. Make freedom so normal people forget it was ever revolutionary. Think it'll work? Don't know, but it's worth trying. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over a place they'd built from nothing, over lives that were messy and complicated and free. Far to the north, Draven sat in his throne room and felt his empire shrinking. Territories declaring independence, nobles switching allegiance, soldiers deserting to join settlements where hierarchy wasn't destiny. He could fight it, send armies to crush every rebellion, burn every alternative settlement to ash, prove through violence that his way was still dominant. But he'd learned something in that battlefield confrontation, that violence without legitimacy was just exhaustion. That power maintained only through force eventually collapsed from the weight of its own brutality. His empire was dying, and maybe it deserved to. He thought about Lyra, about the moment she'd spared him, about the choice she'd made that invalidated everything he'd built his identity around, and he felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years of rule. Respect, not agreement, not surrender, just the acknowledgement that she'd found something he'd never accessed, a strength that came from choosing restraint instead of domination, from building instead of controlling. He couldn't become that, was too far down his own path to change direction completely. But maybe he could stop making things worse, could pull back from territories that didn't want him, could let his empire shrink to people who actually chose to be there instead of those too afraid to leave. It wouldn't be the legacy he'd imagined, wouldn't be the eternal rule he'd worked toward, but it would be honest. And maybe that mattered more than he'd realized. 1 year after walking out of the palace, Lyra received a letter, delivered by neutral courier, sealed with wax that bore Draven's personal mark. She almost didn't open it, almost threw it in the fire and moved on with her life. But curiosity won. She broke the seal and read 3 sentences written in handwriting she recognized. You were right. About everything. I'm sorry it took this long to say it. No signature, no explanation, just acknowledgement. She read it 3 times, then burned it. Not from anger, but from completion. From the sense that a chapter was finally, truly closed. Because here's the thing about revenge and justice and all the ways we try to balance cosmic scales. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemy. It's becoming so completely yourself that their opinion stops mattering. Draven's apology changed nothing. Didn't undo the pain he'd caused. Didn't resurrect the people who died because of his decisions. Didn't make the years of suffering disappear. But it proved he'd heard her. that the truth she'd forced him to confront had actually reached through his certainty, and that was enough. She went back to her work, building systems, resolving disputes, training the next generation of leaders who'd hopefully do better than both she and Draven had done, living a life that was difficult and exhausting and absolutely hers. 5 years passed. Lyra's settlement became a city, became a hub for trade and learning and alternative governance that people came from hundreds of miles to study. The empire still existed in reduced form. Other settlements had grown into their own territories. The map had been rewritten by people choosing their own paths instead of accepting assigned ones. It wasn't perfect, wasn't utopia. People still fought and struggled and made mistakes, but they did it as participants in their own lives instead of pieces in someone else's game. And that made all the difference. Lyra stood on a hillside overlooking the city she'd built from nothing. She was older now, not physically aged that much, but worn by leadership in ways that showed around her eyes and in the way she carried herself. The silver light still lived under her skin, but she'd learned to keep it quiet, to use it only when necessary instead of letting it define her. She thought about the girl who'd stood in a throne room and been told she was worthless. Thought about how that moment had felt like the end of everything, how she'd walked out into exile believing her life was over. That girl was gone, had died and been rebuilt a dozen times over, had become someone unrecognizable to the naive woman who'd believed in destiny and fairy tales. This version was harder, scarred, carrying weight that never fully lifted. But she was real, honest, built on choices instead of roles, and she'd created space for thousands of others to be real too. That was the legacy, not conquest or control or the ability to dominate, just the stubborn refusal to accept that the world had to work one way. The willingness to build alternatives even when everyone said it was impossible. She smiled. It hurt a little. The way smiling always hurt when you'd seen too much. But it was genuine. Far to the north, in a palace that was emptier than it used to be, Draven looked out over a capital that was quieter now, smaller, less certain of its own importance. He was older too, the kind of aging that came from carrying regret and learning too late that certainty was just fear in disguise. He thought about Lyra sometimes, wondered what she'd built in the territories he'd stopped trying to control. Wondered if she ever thought about the moment she'd spared him, if she knew what that choice had done to his certainty. He'd never know, would never see her again, would live the rest of his life with the knowledge that his greatest opponent had beaten him by refusing to destroy him, by showing that strength could look like mercy when mercy came from genuine power rather than weakness. It was a lesson he'd learned too late to change his own path, but maybe not too late to stop making things worse. He turned from the window and went back to the work of managing a smaller empire, of ruling people who chose to be there instead of those trapped by circumstance. It wasn't glorious, wasn't the destiny he'd imagined, but it was honest, and maybe that mattered more than glory ever had. Two people, two paths, both shaped by the moment when one rejected the other and both refused to accept the roles they'd been assigned, both scarred by choices that had cost more than either anticipated, both alive in ways that glory and conquest could never touch. The rejected queen had built a city from ruins. The Alpha King had learned that empires could shrink and the man inside could survive. And between them, they'd changed the world not through grand battles or perfect victories, but through the stubborn refusal to stop being human, even when power demanded otherwise. That's what survival looks like when you strip away the myths, not transcendence or redemption or any of the pretty stories people tell. Just the willingness to keep breathing, keep choosing, keep building even when everything says it's pointless. Keep being yourself even when the world wants you to be something smaller. And maybe in the end, that's the only victory that actually matters. Lyra looked out over her city as evening fell, watched lights coming on in windows, heard laughter from the streets below, felt the weight of responsibility and the satisfaction of purpose mixing together into something that felt almost like peace. She was done running, done proving herself, done fighting battles that didn't need fighting. She was just living, building, being, and after everything she'd survived, that felt like enough. The story could end here, with the queen who'd been rejected becoming the founder of something new, with the king who'd done the rejecting learning to live with consequences, with two people who destroyed each other finding separate paths to something resembling redemption. But stories don't really end. They just reach moments where the telling stops and life continues beyond the frame. So this is where we stop, where the telling gives way to living, where the lessons have been learned and the changes made, and all that's left is the long work of building on foundations laid in blood and defiance. Lyra turned from the view and went back to her city, back to the work that never finished, back to the life she'd built from nothing. And somewhere in the north, Draven did the same. Different paths, different choices. Same understanding that power without purpose was just violence dressed up in ceremony. They'd both paid for their mistakes. Both learned lessons that came too late to undo damage. Both survived when survival had seemed impossible. And in surviving, they'd changed the rules, made the impossible possible, proved that certainty was just another prison and the only real freedom came from choosing your own chains. That's the story. The rejected queen who built a kingdom from outcasts. The alpha king who learned that empires built on fear eventually collapse under their own weight. The moment when defiance became transformation and transformation became legacy. Not perfect, not clean, but real. And in the end, that's all any story can be. Real.